My husband and I were married for 48 years, 48 birthdays, 48 anniversaries, 48 Christmas mornings, nearly half a century of building a life together. When people looked at Richard, they saw a respected businessman. When I looked at him, I still saw the young man who nervously held my hand outside a tiny church on a rainy spring afternoon and whispered, "I promise you'll never face this world alone." He kept that promise until the day cancer took him away. Even now, 3 weeks after his funeral arrangements had begun, I still found myself reaching across the bed some mornings, forgetting that his side would always be empty. Grief does strange things to memory. Some days you remember every detail. Other days your mind refuses to believe they are really gone. The morning of the memorial service, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror longer than usual. The black dress hanging in my closet had been Richard's favorite. "You always look elegant in the navy," he used to tell me. So I chose the dark navy dress instead. Simple, respectful. The pearl necklace he bought me on our 25th anniversary rested gently against my neck. I looked at my reflection, not because I cared how I looked, because I wanted to look like the woman Richard would have been proud to stand beside one last time. I gently picked up our wedding photograph from the dresser. His smile, my smile. Two young people who believed love could survive anything. For 48 years, it had. I touched the edge of the frame. "I hope I make you proud today." Then I placed it back exactly where it belonged. Outside, the morning sky hung low over Savannah. Gray clouds drifted slowly across the church steeple as my taxi pulled into the parking lot. The church was already full. Luxury cars lined both sides of the entrance. Friends, business partners, neighbors, former employees, people Richard had helped over the years. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, several familiar faces approached. "Margaret, I'm so sorry. He was a wonderful man. He spoke about you all the time." I smiled politely, thanked each of them, but my heart wasn't really listening. I simply wanted to get through the day. Inside the church, soft piano music floated through the sanctuary. White lilies surrounded Richard's portrait. Rows of polished wooden pews stretched toward the altar. The first 3 rows had elegant white ribbons tied across them, reserved for family. I took a slow breath. Family. For nearly 50 years, that word had always included me. I began walking toward the front. Then I heard my daughter's voice. "Mom." I turned. Emily was walking toward me in a tailored black dress, her expression tight. She kissed my cheek quickly, not warmly, politely. "We need to talk." Something in her tone made my stomach tighten. "What is it, sweetheart?" She glanced toward the reserved pews, then lowered her voice. "We've rearranged the seating." I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" She shifted uncomfortably. "The front rows are for immediate family." I smiled gently. "Yes." She avoided my eyes. So, there was an awkward pause. "I need you to sit farther back." For a moment, I honestly thought I'd misunderstood her. "I'm sorry?" Emily sighed. "Mom, please don't make this difficult." I stared at her. "I don't understand." She looked around nervously, making sure nobody was listening. "My in-laws are here." I blinked. "And?" "They'll be sitting in the front." I waited, still expecting her to laugh and tell me she was joking. Instead, she quietly said the words that would stay with me forever. "You aren't really an immediate family anymore." The world seemed to stop. The piano kept playing. People continued talking. Someone laughed near the entrance. But all I could hear was my daughter's voice repeating inside my head, "You aren't really an immediate family anymore." I looked at her, the little girl I had carried, the little girl whose nightmares I used to calm, the little girl whose scraped knees I had kissed, now standing in front of me, telling me I no longer belonged beside my own husband. "Emily," my voice barely came out. "What did you just say?" She folded her arms. "I'm trying to avoid drama. There are important people here. My husband's parents are sitting in the front. They deserve those seats." I searched her face, looking for hesitation, regret, anything. There was none. I glanced toward the front row. Her mother-in-law was already sitting where I had expected to be, laughing quietly with relatives, admiring the flower arrangements, as though she had known Richard her entire life, as though 48 years of marriage meant nothing. Several people had begun watching us. I noticed the sideways glances, the whispers. Emily noticed them too. She leaned closer. "Please, Mom, don't embarrass me." Those words hurt even more than the first ones. Don't embarrass me. After everything Richard and I had sacrificed, after every school tuition, every late night, every birthday, every dream we had put aside so Emily could chase hers, I was now embarrassed. I looked toward Richard's portrait at the front of the church. For just a second, I wondered what he would have done if he'd been standing beside me. Then I remembered. He wasn't. I took a slow breath, smoothed the front of my dress, and smiled. Not because I wasn't hurting, because I refused to give anyone the satisfaction of watching me break. "If that's what you want," I said quietly, "I'll sit in the back." Emily nodded quickly. "Thank you." Then she walked away, just like that. No hug, no apology, no second thought. I slowly turned and walked toward the last rows of the sanctuary. Every step felt heavier than the one before. As I sat alone near the back of the church, I looked toward the front, my husband's seat, surrounded by strangers. And that's when I noticed someone watching me, an elderly man in a dark gray suit, Richard's attorney, Mr. Benjamin Carter. He wasn't looking at the service. He was looking directly at me. Our eyes met. His expression changed. Not surprising. No pity. Recognition. Almost as if he had been expecting this exact moment. Then he gave me the smallest nod. A nod that said only one thing. Richard knew. And suddenly, for the first time that morning, I realized my husband may have prepared for something I never saw coming. Benjamin Carter's small nod stayed with me throughout the service. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't a surprise. It was a certainty, as though he had been waiting for this exact moment. I tried to focus on the pastor's words, but my mind had already drifted somewhere else. Back to another church, another aisle, another day. 48 years earlier, Richard wasn't wealthy when we met. He worked at his father's hardware store 6 days a week. I taught third grade at the elementary school across town. Neither of us had much money. Our first apartment was barely large enough for 2 people. When it rained, we placed pots on the floor because the roof leaked. Our dining table came from a thrift store. Our sofa had belonged to Richard's aunt, and our first anniversary dinner was 2 hamburgers shared on a park bench because we couldn't afford a restaurant. We laughed anyway, because we believed we already had everything we needed, each other. Richard used to tell me something I'll never forget. Money should make people more generous, not more important. For years, he'd lived exactly that way. As his business grew, nothing about him really changed. He still drove the same old pickup truck, still carried cash to tip waitresses, still stopped whenever he saw someone stranded on the roadside. He never forgot where he came from. Maybe that's why everyone respected him. not because he became successful, because success never changed him. When Emily was born, he cried harder than I did. He held her in the hospital nursery and whispered, "I'll spend the rest of my life making sure she never doubts she's loved." He kept that promise. Every dance recital, every school plays, every science fair, he never missed one. Neither did I. There were years when money became tight again. The business almost failed during one recession. I quietly sold my grandmother's jewelry without telling Richard. I wanted the payroll covered before Christmas. When he found out months later, he held me for nearly an hour. "I'll buy you every piece back someday." I smiled. I never wanted the jewelry. I wanted our family. Those were the years that built us. Not because they were easy, because we survived them together. Emily grew up watching all of it. She knew every sacrifice. Or at least, I believed she did. Things began changing after college. She met Daniel. He came from a very wealthy family, beautiful homes, private schools, country clubs, vacations in Europe. None of that bothered Richard. He welcomed Daniel with open arms. He often said, "If he loves our daughter, he's welcome in this family." For a while, everything seemed perfect. Then small things began happening, things I barely noticed. Emily started correcting the way I dressed before family dinners. She suggested I buy more elegant clothes. She laughed when I brought homemade desserts instead of ordering them from expensive bakeries. She slowly stopped introducing me as her mother. Instead, she'd simply say, "This is Margaret." I remember mentioning it to Richard once. He became unusually quiet. "Did that bother you?" he asked. "A little." He nodded slowly. "It bothered me too. I didn't think much of it. I assumed she was just trying to fit into a different world." Richard didn't seem so convinced. Over the next few years, I noticed him watching her more carefully, not judging, observing. Sometimes we'd leave family dinners and he'd sit silently during the drive home. Finally, I'd ask, "What are you thinking?" He'd smile faintly. "I'm thinking success tests people differently than hardship." "What do you mean?" He kept his eyes on the road. "When life gets easier, you find out what was already inside someone's heart." At the time, I thought he was simply becoming philosophical with age. I never imagined he was talking about our daughter. About 2 years before he passed away, he asked me an unusual question. "If something ever happened to me, would you be all right living alone?" I laughed. "You're not going anywhere." He smiled. "I hope not. But promise me something. Anything. Never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong in the life we built together." I teased him. "Who's going to do that?" Instead of answering, he looked out the kitchen window, almost as though he already knew, almost as though he had seen something I hadn't. The last few months of his illness were difficult. Cancer took away his strength, but never his mind. Benjamin Carter visited the house several times. I assumed they were discussing business, estate taxes, company paperwork, things husbands usually handle. Whenever I offered to leave the room, Richard would smile. "No need, we're almost finished." I never once asked what they were discussing. I trusted him completely. Now, sitting alone in the last row of the church, watching strangers occupy the seats where I should have been, I couldn't stop wondering. Had those meetings been about today? Had Richard somehow known this would happen? The pastor closed his Bible. The congregation slowly stood. The memorial service had ended. People began making their way toward the fellowship hall. Emily stood near the front, greeting guests with practiced smiles. Her mother in law remained beside her, accepting condolences as though she had lost a husband herself. I stayed where I was, not because I couldn't stand it, because I suddenly felt something I hadn't felt since Richard died: curiosity. Benjamin Carter walked toward me. He stopped beside my pew. His voice was gentle. "Mrs. Ellis." I looked up. He offered his hand. "When you're ready, we'll be meeting at my office." He paused, then added something that made my heart skip. "Your husband left very specific instructions, and today we're finally going to honor every one of them." The drive to Benjamin Carter's office was unusually quiet. Most of the family traveled together. Luxury SUVs, black sedans, cars Richard himself had once purchased for family vacations. I rode alone in a taxi, not because I wanted to, because no one had thought to ask if I needed a ride. As we pulled away from the church, I looked through the rear window one last time. Richard's portrait was still visible through the stained glass entrance. For nearly 50 years, that church had witnessed every important chapter of our lives: our wedding, Emily's baptism, her graduation celebration, Richard's business Thanksgiving service after his company survived its hardest year, and now, his final goodbye. I quietly whispered, "I miss you." The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror but said nothing. Sometimes silence is the greatest kindness. 20 minutes later, we arrived outside Carter, Benson, and Associates. Richard had used Benjamin Carter for nearly 30 years. He trusted him completely. The office occupied the top floor of one of Savannah's oldest downtown buildings. Tall white columns, polished marble floors, dark walnut doors. Everything about the place reflected quiet success. Inside the reception area, several members of Richard's executive team were already waiting. Some stood talking softly. Others sat with their hands folded. The mood felt respectful, but beneath that respect, there was anticipation. Everyone knew why they were here. Benjamin's assistant greeted me warmly. "Mrs. Ellis, we've prepared a seat for you." I thanked her. As I entered the conference room, my eyes immediately searched for somewhere quiet. Instead, Emily's voice interrupted again. "There she is." She smiled politely, almost too politely. It was the kind of smile people wear when others are watching, not because they mean it. "Mom, I'm glad you made it." I simply nodded. Daniel stood beside her. His expensive navy suit looked freshly tailored. His hand rested casually on the back of one of the leather chairs. He gave me a brief smile, not unfriendly, not warm, simply distant. His parents were already seated beside him. Margaret Holloway, gracefully dressed, diamond earrings, perfect posture, and beside her, Charles Holloway, retired judge, highly respected. Margaret looked at me and offered a sympathetic smile. "I'm terribly sorry for your loss." "Richard was an extraordinary man." "Thank you," I answered quietly. She returned to her conversation. For a brief moment, I wondered if she had any idea what had happened inside the church earlier. If she knew, she gave no sign. Benjamin Carter entered the room carrying a thick leather portfolio. The conversations immediately stopped. He placed the folder carefully on the conference table. Then I looked around the room. "Thank you all for coming." His calm voice instantly commanded attention. "As you know, Richard Ellis left very detailed instructions regarding today's meeting." He paused, and he specifically requested that every named beneficiary be present before any document was opened. His assistant quietly counted the attendees, then nodded. "Everyone is here." Benjamin adjusted his glasses. "Good." Emily leaned slightly toward Daniel, almost excited. I noticed it immediately. She wasn't grieving anymore. She was waiting. Waiting to hear numbers, properties, accounts, investments. Richard had built one of Savannah's most respected construction companies over 4 decades. There was no secret about that. The company owned commercial buildings, rental properties, land, investments. Everyone knew his estate was substantial. I wasn't thinking about money. I would have traded every dollar for one more afternoon sitting beside Richard on our back porch. But not everyone in the room seemed to feel that way. Benjamin hadn't even opened the folder before Emily quietly asked, "How long do you think this will take?" Benjamin looked directly at her. "As long as your father wanted it to." The room became silent. Emily forced a smile. "Of course." Benjamin slowly removed the first document. Before reading a single word, he looked around the table. "I'd like to remind everyone of something. These instructions were written by Richard himself. They were reviewed multiple times. They were witnessed. They were notarized. And every instruction must be followed exactly as written." Something about the way he emphasized those last words caught my attention. Exactly as written. He wasn't simply explaining legal procedure, he was preparing us. Emily crossed one leg over the other. Daniel checked his watch. Someone poured coffee. The room settled into silence. Benjamin opened the first page. The last will and testament of Richard Thomas Ellis. His deep voice echoed softly through the conference room. For the next several minutes, he handled routine matters: charitable donations, scholarship funds, church contributions, gifts to longtime employees, bonuses for loyal staff members. Richard had remembered everyone, even the groundskeeper who had worked at the company for 22 years. I smiled. That sounded exactly like my husband. Emily, however, began shifting impatiently. She whispered something to Daniel. He whispered back. Benjamin continued reading without acknowledging them. Then he stopped, turned another page, and carefully removed a sealed white envelope. Unlike the other documents, this one had Richard's handwriting across the front. Benjamin looked directly at me. "Mrs. Ellis, I believe your husband wanted you to see this." My heart began beating faster. He carefully placed the envelope in front of me. I stared at Richard's familiar handwriting. "To my beloved Margaret, for your eyes first." The room became completely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Emily leaned forward. Daniel frowned. Benjamin folded his hands together, then quietly said something that changed the atmosphere completely. Before I continue reading the will, Richard instructed me to read this letter aloud. I slowly looked up. Benjamin met my eyes, then said, "And after this letter, everything in this room is going to change." Nobody spoke. The room had become so quiet that I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Benjamin carefully broke the seal on the envelope. His movements were slow, respectful, almost ceremonial. I couldn't take my eyes off Richard's handwriting. It looked exactly as it always had: strong, confident, neat. Seeing it again made my chest tighten. For just a moment, it felt as though he were still alive, still sitting beside me, still squeezing my hand beneath the dinner table whenever he noticed I was nervous. Benjamin unfolded the pages. There were several, far more than I expected. He adjusted his glasses and looked around the conference room. I was instructed to read every word exactly as written. He paused, without interruption. His eyes briefly settled on Emily. Then he began. "My dearest Margaret." The sound of Richard's words immediately filled the room. "If Benjamin is reading this letter, then I'm no longer sitting beside you. I wish with all my heart that things had turned out differently. But life doesn't always give us the ending we hope for." I lowered my eyes. My hands rested quietly in my lap. I could almost hear Richard speaking. Benjamin wasn't reading anymore. Richard was. "You gave me 48 years of love, 48 years of loyalty. You stood beside me when I had nothing. You believed in me before anyone else did. You worked 2 jobs so I could keep my business alive. You sold your grandmother's jewelry without telling me because you refused to let my employees lose their jobs before Christmas." Several people slowly turned toward me. I hadn't realized Richard knew every detail. I never told anyone, not even Emily. Benjamin continued. You never once asked me to repay those sacrifices. You simply called it marriage. A tear rolled down my cheek. I didn't wipe it away. I simply let it fall. Across the table, Emily shifted uncomfortably. Daniel quietly looked down. Richard's words continued. There were many times people congratulated me for building a successful company. The truth is, we built it. I simply signed the paperwork. You carried the weight. My breathing became slower, steadier. It felt as though Richard was reaching across time itself, holding my hand one last time. Benjamin turned another page. Then his voice became more serious. There is another reason I wrote this letter. I owe everyone in this room the truth. Emily's head slowly lifted. Daniel looked toward Benjamin. The atmosphere changed. Every person in the conference room seemed to lean forward. I began noticing changes several years ago. Small changes at first. Our daughter stopped introducing Margaret as her mother. She corrected the way Margaret dressed. She laughed at simple gifts. She slowly became embarrassed by the woman who sacrificed everything for her. Emily immediately shook her head. Dad didn't mean. Benjamin calmly raised one hand. Mrs. Ellis, your father specifically instructed that there be no interruptions. The room became silent again. Benjamin continued reading. I prayed I was imagining it. I hoped it was only temporary, but each year it became harder to ignore. I watched my wife become quieter. I watched her apologize for things that required no apology. I watched her slowly accept being treated like a guest inside the family she helped build. Emily's face had become pale. Daniel looked at her, then away. Richard's words continued. I never discussed this openly because I believed people can change. I believed kindness would eventually be returned. I wanted to be wrong. Benjamin paused, his voice lowered. But then something happened. The room seemed to hold its breath. 6 months before my diagnosis, I overheard a conversation that changed everything. Emily's eyes widened. Daniel looked completely confused. Benjamin read carefully. I heard Emily telling someone, once Dad is gone, everything will finally be ours. I stood outside the study for several minutes. I hoped I had misunderstood, but then she laughed and said, Mom won't know what to do with any of it anyway. The conference room fell into absolute silence. No one moved. Emily's face turned white. That's not, she stopped herself. Benjamin hadn't looked up once. He simply continued reading. That was the day I called Benjamin Carter. Not because I stopped loving my daughter, because I realized I needed to protect my wife. The words struck the room like thunder. Protect my wife. Not protect the company. Not protect the estate. Protect my wife. Benjamin looked toward me briefly, then continued. If you're hearing this letter, I fear something happened after my death. I fear Margaret was made to feel less important. I fear she was treated as though our marriage ended the day my heart stopped beating. I felt tears sliding quietly down my face. Because he knew me better than anyone. He knew exactly what would hurt me most. Benjamin turned to the final page of the letter. The next part of my will may surprise some of you. It certainly surprised Benjamin. A faint smile appeared on the attorney's face, as if remembering the conversation. Richard continued, I've had years to think about what truly belongs to whom, and I reached one conclusion. The greatest mistake a husband can make is assuming his wife will always be protected after he's gone. Benjamin slowly lowered the letter. Then I looked around the room. I believe this is where Richard wanted us to pause. Emily frowned. What do you mean? Benjamin reached inside the leather portfolio. removed another document. This one was much thicker, bound with blue legal ribbon. He carefully placed it on the table, then looked directly at Emily. Because everything I've read so far, he paused, was only his explanation. He rested one hand on the document. What comes next? He said quietly. It's his decision. No one in the conference room spoke. Every eye was fixed on the thick document resting beneath Benjamin Carter's hand. The blue ribbon around it suddenly looked heavier than before. Emily sat perfectly still. Only moments earlier she had looked impatient. Now she looked uncertain. Daniel leaned closer to her, quietly whispering, "What did your father mean?" Emily barely shook her head. "I don't know." Benjamin slowly untied the ribbon. He did it with extraordinary care. Not because it was difficult, because Richard had asked him to. Every movement seemed intentional. Every second stretched the tension inside the room. When the ribbon finally came free, Benjamin opened the document. "This," he said calmly, "is the final version of Richard Ellis's last will and testament." He glanced toward me. "Signed 8 months before his passing." I frowned slightly. 8 months. That was shortly after Richard had returned from one of his chemotherapy treatments. I remembered that day. He had seemed unusually peaceful. That evening, he held my hand on the back porch while we watched the sunset. He asked me something strange. "If tomorrow was my last day, would you know how much I love you?" At the time, I laughed through my tears. "You've spent 48 years proving it." He smiled. "I hope that's enough." Now, sitting in Benjamin's office, I realized the conversation had meant far more than I understood. Benjamin began reading. "I, Richard Thomas Ellis, being of sound mind and full mental capacity, declare this to be my final will." His steady voice filled the room. The opening pages dealt with routine matters: funeral expenses, outstanding charitable commitments, business obligations, longtime employees. Richard had remembered everyone. His executive assistant received a generous retirement fund. His driver received the truck Richard knew he loved. The church received money for a scholarship program. His cancer treatment center received a donation for patients unable to afford care. Several employees quietly lowered their heads. One man wiped away tears. That was Richard. Even in death, he was still taking care of people. Emily shifted impatiently again. She wasn't interested in these gifts. She was waiting for something else. Everyone knew it. Benjamin turned another page. The family lake house. He paused. "I leave it to my granddaughter, Olivia Ellis." Emily smiled. Daniel smiled too. Olivia was their 12-year-old daughter. Benjamin continued, "Under the condition that Margaret Ellis may enjoy unrestricted use of the property for the remainder of her life." Emily's smile faded slightly. Benjamin continued reading. "My classic Mustang. To my grandson, Ethan. My collection of antique watches to my longtime friend, Harold Simmons." Again, small gifts, meaningful gifts, but not the estate. The atmosphere inside the room slowly changed. People began exchanging glances. Even Daniel looked confused. Emily finally spoke. "What about the company?" Benjamin calmly raised his eyes. "I'll reach that section shortly." She nodded, but her foot began tapping beneath the table, a habit she had inherited from Richard whenever he became impatient. Ironically, it was the only thing she seemed to have inherited from him so far. Benjamin turned another page, then another. Finally, he reached the section everyone had been waiting for, the Ellis Construction Group. The room became silent. Richard's company employed nearly 300 people. It had taken him 40 years to build. Everyone expected it to pass directly to Emily. Benjamin adjusted his glasses. As sole owner of Ellis Construction Group, I leave operational leadership to the board of directors. Daniel frowned. Emily looked confused. Benjamin continued. Until the individual named in the following paragraph assumes final authority. Now everyone leaned forward. Emily folded her hands together. Benjamin read slowly. I have an appointment. He paused briefly. My wife, Margaret Ann Ellis. The room froze. As sole owner of Ellis Construction Group. Silence. Absolute silence. Emily blinked. What? Benjamin continued reading as though no one had spoken. All voting rights, all ownership shares, all executive authority shall belong exclusively to Margaret Ann Ellis. Daniel stared at Benjamin. Excuse me? Benjamin didn't stop. Effective immediately upon my death. Emily shook her head. No, she laughed nervously. No, that's impossible. Benjamin calmly slid another document across the table. Stock certificates. Already transferred. Emily looked at the paperwork, then back at Benjamin. No, Benjamin continued. The downtown office building, the commercial warehouse, the investment accounts, the rental properties, the family residence. He paused, then looked directly at me. I leave entirely to my beloved wife. The room exploded. Emily stood so quickly her chair fell backward. There has to be some mistake. Daniel stood beside her. This can't be right. Benjamin remained perfectly calm. It is entirely correct. Emily's breathing became faster. I'm his only child. Benjamin nodded. Yes. So why would he leave everything to her? Benjamin quietly answered, because that's what he chose. Emily looked at me. For the first time all day, there was fear in her eyes. Not grief. Fear. Real fear. She turned back toward Benjamin. There has to be another page. Benjamin nodded slowly. There is. Relief instantly appeared on Emily's face. I knew it. Benjamin picked up the final sealed envelope resting beneath the will. This envelope, he said quietly, contains Richard's explanation for why his daughter received exactly what she received. Emily smiled again. I'm sure this clears everything up. Benjamin looked directly into her eyes. His expression never changed. It certainly does. Then he slowly opened the final envelope, and before reading a single word, he said something that made every person in the room stop breathing. Richard instructed me to tell you that this final letter was written only for Emily. No one moved. Emily stood frozen beside her chair. Her face had lost every trace of confidence. Benjamin Carter held the sealed envelope in his hands for a long moment before opening it. This letter, he said quietly, was written specifically for Emily. He looked directly at her. Your father instructed me to read it aloud. Emily swallowed. I'd rather read it myself. Benjamin slowly shook his head. I'm afraid your father was very clear. He wanted every word heard by everyone in this room. The conference room fell silent again. Benjamin carefully unfolded the pages. Then he began. My dear Emily, if you're hearing this letter, then the decision I've made has already become public. I imagine you're angry, perhaps even shocked. But before you decide I've been unfair, I need you to remember something. I loved you from the moment I first held you. I loved you when you learned to ride your bicycle. I loved you when you graduated college. I loved you on your wedding day. And I love you now. Emily's eyes filled with tears. Benjamin continued. This decision was never about love, it was about trust. The words landed heavily. Richard's voice seemed alive again. When you were little, your mother taught you to share. She taught you kindness. She taught you gratitude. She taught you that people mattered more than possessions. I was proud of the woman you were becoming. Benjamin paused only long enough to turn the page. Then something changed. Not all at once. So slowly that your mother hardly noticed. But I did. Emily stared at the table. Daniel reached for her hand. She quietly pulled it away. I watched you become embarrassed by simple things. I watched you apologize for your mother's modest clothes. I watched you speak differently when wealthy people were around. I watched you slowly begin measuring people by what they owned. Several relatives lowered their eyes. No one dared interrupt. I kept hoping you would find your way back. I truly believed you would, but each year you moved farther away. Benjamin's voice remained calm. One afternoon, after your mother baked your favorite peach pie, I heard you tell Daniel that homemade desserts looked cheap. Emily closed her eyes. A tear rolled slowly down her cheek. I watched your mother's smile disappear. She pretended not to hear you. But I did, Benjamin continued. On another occasion, I watched you introduce your mother simply as Margaret. You never noticed how quickly she looked down, but I did. The room remained completely still. Every sentence seemed heavier than the last. And then came the day I knew I had to make a decision. Benjamin turned another page. I wasn't in my study. I was standing just outside the door. I heard you speaking with Daniel. Emily's breathing became shallow. Benjamin continued reading. You said, Dad has always been too emotional. Once he's gone, Mom won't know how to handle the company. We'll sell everything and finally simplify our lives. The room felt frozen. Daniel immediately looked toward Emily. I never said, Emily whispered, then stopped, because even she knew no one believed her. Richard's words continued. In that moment, I realized something painful. My daughter had begun treating our life's work as an inheritance instead of a responsibility. But what hurt me most was hearing you speak about your mother as though she had contributed nothing. Benjamin looked toward me briefly, then continued. Emily, every building I ever owned, your mother helped me buy it. Every payroll I ever made, she was protected. Every difficult decision I survived. I survived because she stood beside me. You inherited my name, but she earned everything we built. I covered my mouth. I had no idea Richard carried all of this inside him. For 48 years, he had noticed everything, even the things I tried to ignore. Benjamin continued. I didn't leave everything to your mother because she needed protection financially. I left everything to her because she deserved to be honored. The words echoed through the room. Honor. That was the word Richard chose. Not reward, not compensation. Honor. Benjamin slowly reached the final page. I hope one day you understand this decision. I hope you rebuild your relationship with your mother, but that cannot happen until you first understand what you have done. Emily quietly began crying, not loudly, not dramatically. The quiet tears of someone hearing truths she had spent years avoiding. Benjamin folded the letter carefully, then looked directly at her. I believe your father had one final instruction. He opened another small envelope that had been tucked inside the letter. The paper inside contained only a few handwritten lines. Benjamin read them aloud. If my daughter ever asks why she received so little, tell her to look at where she chose to seat her mother. The room fell into complete silence. Emily's face was drained of color. She slowly turned toward me. For the first time all day, she wasn't looking at the estate. She wasn't looking at the company. She wasn't looking at the house. She was looking at me. And for the first time in years, I saw genuine shame in my daughter's eyes. But Benjamin wasn't finished. He quietly reached beneath the will, pulled out one final leather folder, then said the words no one expected to hear. Richard left one last document, and it changes everything you think you know about this estate. No one spoke. Emily remained frozen in her chair. Her father's final words echoed through the conference room. If my daughter ever asks why she received so little, tell her to look at where she chose to seat her mother. It was as though every person in the room had been transported back to the church. Everyone suddenly understood. Richard hadn't guessed what would happen. He had expected it, months before his death, perhaps even years. Emily slowly covered her mouth. Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. I didn't think. Her voice disappeared. Benjamin looked at her with compassion, not satisfied. Compassion. Your father hoped you never would. The room fell silent again. Benjamin rested one hand on the final leather folder. I've practiced law for 43 years. I've read hundreds of wills. I've handled complicated estates. He paused. But I've never handled one like Richard's. Several relatives looked at him. What makes this one different? Benjamin smiled sadly. Because Richard wasn't simply dividing property. He was trying to save his family. His words settled heavily over the room. Then he opened the leather folder. Inside were dozens of handwritten pages, photographs, receipts, business documents, even old birthday cards. Emily looked confused. What is all that? Benjamin carefully removed the first photograph. He placed it in the center of the table. It showed Richard and me standing beside an empty lot. We were young. Our clothes were dusty. Both of us were smiling. The year was 1983, Benjamin said. This was the first piece of land Richard ever purchased. He slid another document beside it. A bank statement. The down payment had come from my savings account. Benjamin continued. The next document. Another photograph. This time it showed me sitting behind a tiny folding desk inside a construction trailer, holding a calculator, stacks of invoices beside me. I remember that office, I whispered. Richard smiled in the picture. So do I, Benjamin nodded. Your husband asked me to show everyone these. Emily stared silently. Benjamin continued placing photographs across the conference table, one after another. Me answering company phones, me delivering paperwork, me helping clean newly completed homes before buyers arrived, me serving food to construction workers during overtime weekends. Every photograph told the same story. I hadn't simply been Richard's wife. I'd been there from the beginning. Benjamin laid down another document. This payroll record shows Mrs. Ellis paying employee salaries while Mr. Ellis recovered from surgery. Another. This invoice bears only Mrs. Ellis's signature. Another. This loan application required Mrs. Ellis to mortgage jewelry she inherited from her grandmother. Daniel looked stunned. You mortgaged family jewelry? I smiled faintly. We needed equipment. It seemed more important. Emily looked at me. Her expression slowly changed. She had never known. Or perhaps she had never asked. Benjamin reached for another envelope. This one contains Richard's final business instructions. He unfolded the paper. If anyone questions why Margaret owns this company, show them these records. They'll discover something I should have said while I was alive. Benjamin looked directly at me, then read aloud. There would never have been an Ellis Construction Group without Margaret Ellis. The words seemed to fill the entire room. Richard had never said that publicly, not once. Not because he didn't believe it, because he never cared who received the credit. Benjamin continued, "For 48 years, people called me the founder. They were only half right. The true foundation of this company was the woman waiting at home every night." I lowered my eyes, trying unsuccessfully to stop crying. Emily quietly sobbed. Benjamin carefully folded the letter, then reached for one final document. "This," he said softly, "was to be opened only if Margaret was publicly humiliated after Richard's death." The room became absolutely still. Emily stared. "What?" Benjamin nodded. "Richard insisted this envelope remain sealed unless that exact condition occurred." He slowly opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. Only 3 sentences. Benjamin cleared his throat. "If my wife has been treated as anything less than the center of this family, I ask everyone present to remember this one truth. My wife was never standing in my shadow. I was standing beside hers." No one breathed. Even the clock seemed to stop ticking. Benjamin carefully folded the note. Then I looked around the room. "I've honored every instruction Richard left." He turned toward me. "Mrs. Ellis, your husband asked me to say one final thing." My heart pounded. Benjamin smiled gently. "He wanted you to know you were never second. You were always first." The words broke something inside me. Not because they gave me money, not because they gave me the company, because after 48 years, the man I loved had found one final way to protect my dignity. Across the table, Emily slowly stood. She wasn't looking at the estate anymore. She wasn't looking at the company. She wasn't looking at the legal papers. She was looking only at me. And in her eyes, for the first time in years, I saw no entitlement, not pride, not ambition, only regret. She opened her mouth to speak, but before a single word came out, Benjamin quietly slid one last small envelope across the table. "This one," he said, "is from your mother." I stared at him in confusion. "I didn't write anything." Benjamin smiled. "Just Margaret." I gently ran my fingertips across the paper. For a brief moment, I couldn't bring myself to open it. It wasn't fear, it was grief. Every piece of his handwriting felt like another goodbye. Benjamin spoke softly. "Richard told me this letter should be read only after every other instruction had been carried out. He said this one wasn't about the estate. It was about your future." I slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded page. The paper was worn around the edges, as though Richard had rewritten it several times before deciding these were the words he wanted to leave behind. My hands trembled. Benjamin looked at me. "Would you like me to read it?" I quietly shook my head. No. For the first time that afternoon, I wanted to hear Richard's words in my own voice. I unfolded the letter, took a slow breath, then began reading aloud. "My beautiful Margaret, if you're holding this letter, then you've already survived the hardest day of your life. I wish more than anything that I could be sitting beside you, holding your hand, whispering that everything will be all right. But since I cannot, I need you to remember something." I paused. The words blurred through tears. I took another breath, then continued. "You spent 48 years believing your greatest purpose was taking care of everyone else. You took care of me. You took care of our daughter. You took care of my employees. You took care of strangers. Now, no, you didn't. But Richard did. He wrote it in your name." The room had become so quiet that no one seemed willing to breathe. Benjamin Carter carefully slid the final envelope across the polished conference table until it stopped in front of me. My name was written across the front in Richard's unmistakable handwriting. Margaret, no one else. It's finally your turn. The room remained completely still. I continued reading. I know you. I know exactly what you're thinking. You're wondering whether you deserve everything I've left you. The answer is yes. Not because I loved you, because you earned it. I slowly lowered the page for a moment. The tears wouldn't stop. Across the table, Emily covered her face with both hands. Daniel quietly stared at the floor. Richard's words continued. There will be people who tell you to forgive quickly. There will be people who ask you to hand everything over. There will be people who say family matters more than principles. Listen carefully. They're only half right. I paused again. Every eye remained fixed on me. Family does matter, but respect matters too. And love without respect eventually becomes an obligation. Those words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. No one moved, no one dared interrupt. I reached the final section of the letter. If Emily truly changes, you'll know. You won't need anyone to convince you. Real repentance is never spoken first, it's lived. So don't reward promises, reward change. The conference room remained silent. I looked up briefly. Emily wasn't crying quietly anymore. She was openly weeping, not because of the money, because every sentence described the daughter she had become. I continued, I've spent my entire life trusting your heart. I trust it now. So whatever decision you make after today, I'll be proud of it. Then I reached the final paragraph, the one Richard had underlined twice. My greatest achievement was never the company. It was never the buildings. It was never the investments. My greatest achievement was loving you. And if anyone ever makes you feel like you don't belong, remember this. You were never standing behind me. You walked beside me every step of the way. The room dissolved into silence. I slowly folded the letter. For several moments, no one spoke. Then a chair scraped softly against the floor. Emily stood. Her shoulders shook uncontrollably. She looked nothing like the confident woman who had told me to sit in the back of the church. She looked broken. She slowly walked around the conference table. Every step seemed heavier than the last. When she reached me, she stopped. Neither of us spoke. Finally, she dropped to her knees beside my chair, exactly where Richard had once knelt 48 years earlier when he asked me to marry him. She couldn't even look at me. I'm sorry. The words barely escaped her lips. I'm so sorry. Fresh tears rolled down her face. I became someone Dad would never recognize. She buried her face in her hands. I don't even recognize myself. The room remained silent. Benjamin quietly removed his glasses. Several relatives wiped away tears. Even Daniel's eyes were red. Emily looked up. I thought money meant success. I thought appearances mattered. I thought people would respect me if I looked important. She shook her head. I forgot who taught me what really mattered. Then she looked directly into my eyes. You did. I traded your love for other people's approval. I am ashamed of myself. She reached for my hand, then hesitated, as though she no longer believed she had the right. I quietly placed my hand over hers. She immediately broke down again. I'm sorry I embarrassed you. I'm sorry I pushed you away. I'm sorry I made you feel like you weren't family. I would give everything back if I could erase what I did. I looked at my daughter, not the successful woman sitting across a conference table, the little girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder after thunderstorms. The little girl who once believed I could fix everything. For the first time in years, I saw her again. But forgiveness? It wasn't as simple as saying the words. because Richard had been right. Promises are easy, change is difficult. And I realized what happened next would determine whether our family truly had a future. For several moments, I simply looked at my daughter. Emily remained on her knees beside my chair, the same daughter who, only hours earlier, had quietly told me I wasn't family enough to sit in the front row at my own husband's memorial service. Now she couldn't even bring herself to meet my eyes. The room waited. Benjamin Carter, Daniel, the Holloways, Richard's longtime employees, friends who had known us for decades. Everyone waited to see what I would do. Would I be angry? Would I remind her of every painful word? Would I make her feel the same humiliation she had made me feel? I thought about it, not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted to understand what Richard would have done. Then I looked down at the letter resting in my hands, the last words my husband would ever write to me. My greatest achievement was loving you. Richard had never answered cruelty with cruelty. He answered it with the truth. So I decided to do the same. I gently reached for Emily's hand. She looked up slowly. Her eyes were swollen from crying. "Stand up, sweetheart." She shook her head. "I don't deserve to." "No," I said quietly, "you don't." Fresh tears filled her eyes. "But I'm asking you to stand anyway." Slowly she did. For the first time since she was a little girl, I held both of her hands. They were trembling. "So listen carefully." My voice remained calm. "I forgive you." The room remained completely silent. Emily burst into tears again. "But forgiveness," I continued, "doesn't erase the consequences." She nodded immediately. "I know. I understand." I searched her face. For the first time in years, there was no pride there, no arrogance, no concern about appearances, only regret, real regret. "I can't give you back the words you heard today," she whispered. "I can't erase what I did." "No," I answered softly, "you can't." Another long silence passed. Then I smiled. "But you can decide who you become tomorrow." Emily closed her eyes. "I want to become the daughter Dad believed I could be." Those words felt honest, not perfect, honest. Benjamin quietly closed Richard's file. "I believe," he said gently. Mr. Ellis would have liked hearing that. A faint smile spread across the room. Not because everything had been fixed, because healing had finally begun. Daniel stepped forward. He looked embarrassed, ashamed. "Mrs. Ellis," he hesitated, "I owe you an apology too." I looked at him quietly. There were times I should have spoken. I knew Emily was becoming too concerned with appearances. I kept telling myself it wasn't my place. He lowered his head. "It was." I nodded gently. "It usually is." The conversation continued for nearly another hour. Not about money, not about the company, about Richard. Everyone began sharing stories. His employees laughed about old construction projects. His friends remembered fishing trips. Benjamin recalled Richard refusing to sue a struggling contractor because he knew the man's family needed another chance. Little by little, the room stopped feeling like a legal meeting. It became what Richard probably wanted all along, a family remembering the man who brought them together. As people prepared to leave, Benjamin handed me a small wooden box. Richard's initials had been carved into the lid. "I almost forgot," he smiled. "He asked me to give you this after everyone finished talking." I carefully opened it. Inside lay Richard's wedding ring. Folded beneath it was one final handwritten note, only one sentence. "When you feel lonely, look around. The life we built is still here." I closed the box, hold it against my heart, and smiled through my tears. Several months passed. Spring slowly gave way to summer, then autumn. Life settled into a quieter rhythm.
I accepted my new role at Ellis Construction Group, not because I wanted to run a company, because I wanted to protect what Richard and I had spent a lifetime building. The first decision I made surprised everyone, especially Emily. I renamed the company's annual employee award. It would no longer honor Richard alone. From that day forward, it would be called the Richard and Margaret Ellis Legacy Award. When the plaque was unveiled, every employee stood and applauded. I quietly looked toward the empty chair that had been placed in the front row, reserved, not for a guest, for Richard. Some people noticed, most didn't. But I knew. And somehow, I think he did too. Emily changed. Not overnight. Real change never happens that way. She began calling every Sunday, not because she felt guilty, because she wanted to. She visited without announcing herself, sometimes just to drink coffee, sometimes to help me garden, sometimes simply to sit on the porch where Richard and I had spent so many evenings together. She never again introduced me as Margaret. From that day forward, everywhere we went, she smiled proudly and said, "This is my mother." The first time I heard those words again, I had to look away so she wouldn't see me crying. One afternoon, nearly a year after Richard's memorial service, Emily asked me something quietly. "Mom, what was the greatest gift Dad ever gave you?" I looked toward the old oak tree in the backyard, the one Richard planted the week we bought our first house. Then I smiled. It wasn't the company. It wasn't the house. It wasn't the money. She waited. It was knowing that even after he was gone, he still made sure I never had to question my worth. Emily nodded slowly. "I hope one day I become the kind of wife you were." I smiled. "You don't have to become me. You only have to become the best version of yourself." She hugged me, longer than she had in years. As I stood there holding my daughter, I realized something Richard had understood long before I did. The greatest inheritance isn't wealth, it isn't property, it isn't a successful business. The greatest inheritance we leave behind is the character we inspire in the people we love. Richard left buildings, he left investments, he left the company, but those weren't his true legacy. His true legacy was reminding a grieving widow that she still mattered, reminding a broken daughter that pride can be replaced by humility, and reminding all of us that love without respect is incomplete. If there's one lesson I carried away from that unforgettable day, it's this: never allow anyone, not even family, to convince you that your sacrifices no longer matter. Know your worth, protect your dignity, and remember, the people who truly love you will never ask you to earn your place in their lives, because love doesn't place you in the back row. Love always saves you a seat in the front. Before you go, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you were in Margaret's place, after everything your daughter said and did, would you have forgiven her, or would you have walked away and protected your peace? Share your answer in the comments below. I read as many of your stories as I can, and this community has become a place where people remind each other that none of us are alone. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Every week, we share powerful stories about family, betrayal, forgiveness, dignity, and the quiet strength of ordinary people facing extraordinary moments. And remember this: never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong in the life you helped build. The people who truly love you will never ask you to earn your place in their hearts. Thank you for watching, and until our next story, take care of yourself, because your love, your sacrifices, and your presence matter more than you may ever realize.